Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am so grateful to be here today, and my hope and intention is that you leave this webinar learning or feeling different than when you arrived. If you're like most people in caregiving roles, you're used to feeling like you always have more to do, a never-ending checklist of tasks, clients, scenarios, or conflicts to attend to, all of which require more energy. It can often feel like we load up our backpacks of boulders, strap it on, and hop right onto the treadmill of life. But I want to be very clear. I am not here to give you more work to do. I am here to help you shift the way you understand the impact of all that doing and to show you how shift change can help you release the weight you're already carrying. So before we dive into the topic for today, I want to ensure that we create a safe space for this conversation. I have 3 agreements that I invite you to enter with me. Agreement number 1. Oh, we have agreement number 1. Is our sound okay? Let me just check that everyone can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So agreement number 1, no judgment. We invite curiosity instead. So can we all agree to reserve no judgment? Instead of engaging in judgment, I want you to notice when it arises. Judgment toward me, judgment towards yourself, or judgment towards someone in the chat. And instead of feeding the judgment, I invite you just to notice it, write it down, and be curious about it. I remember early on when people would tell me that I needed to be more compassionate with myself. I would roll my eyes. Not because I didn't want to or because I couldn't do that for others, but because I had no idea how to do it for myself. So it felt foreign and almost ridiculous. Often, when we are triggered in this way, it is an invitation to look a little deeper. Can we all agree to hold that space today? Agreement number 2. This webinar is recorded and will be shared publicly, and because of that, I want to protect the privacy of everyone here and to ensure that we are not vicariously traumatizing each other during this webinar. So I ask that we not engage in personal storytelling of trauma in the chat. Many of you in this room spend your days in environments where vicarious trauma is common, and I want to ensure that I am keeping the safe space for you and our moderator in the chat as well. So instead of sharing our trauma stories, we are here to learn new ways to process them. Can we all agree to that? And agreement number 3, the chat is open, but your privacy is respected. So if you feel comfortable asking in this space, I encourage you to do so when a question is posed. For ease of delivery, I will answer any questions at the end. If you don't feel comfortable, I honor that too. We live in a culture where fear of retaliation is very real, and I recognize that speaking openly about stress, burnout, and mental health is not always easy. So if you would rather connect privately, I want you to know that my inbox is open. You can email me after this webinar and I will personally respond. Can we all agree to respect each other's decisions and choices in this? Amazing. So as we move forward, let's step into this conversation with awareness, respect, and intention. Because conversations about burnout, trauma, and healing, they are not easy. And I know that I am likely to say something that may rub up against some bruises. And these conversations are necessary. So now that we've established our foundation, let's begin. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like you were drowning? Imagine you're in the middle of the ocean, waves crashing around you. Your arms are tired, your legs are burning, you're swimming furiously, just trying to keep your head above water. And then a boat appears. You think, thank goodness, help, it's here. But instead of pulling you in, they start asking questions. Why are you out here? What were you thinking? Have you tried journaling, meditating, breathing? How about a vacation? Maybe you just need to swim harder, longer. And then they sail away, leaving you even more exhausted and sinking deeper. Does that sound familiar? I'm here to tell you, you don't need more questions or judgment. You need relief. And as someone who, from a very young age, wore the hat of a helper, and as someone who has witnessed many others just like you, I know this. The weight pulling you under is not something you choose. Heck, it's not something you're probably even fully conscious of. And most importantly, you were never meant to carry it all alone. So I'm not here to judge you on how you got into the ocean. I'm not here to ask you to prove you need help. I'm here to show you how we're going to get you out. Because the truth is, many of us were taught to keep swimming, to push through, to survive another day. But what happens when survival mode isn't enough anymore? What happens when our brains and our bodies can no longer hold the weight? That's what we're going to talk about next. For most of us, we were raised in what I call suppression culture. We weren't taught to say no. We weren't taught to wave the white flag when things became too much. Instead, we learned to push through, to be strong, to handle it, to keep going. And that might have worked for a while, but it comes at a cost. In high performance sport, I learned that to be strong and capable, you had to bury your feelings and push through. Pain wasn't something to focus on, it was something to ignore. When my dad was diagnosed with cancer when I was 13, he reinforced this belief without even meaning to. During his 4-year battle with cancer, we never talked about it, never shared our feelings, and never acknowledged the reality of what was happening. He convinced us and he convinced himself that he wasn't going to die until he did. And then we were all left to be with it alone. So I did what I'd always been taught to do, bury and push through. And that belief followed me into my adulthood. I want to pause and everyone take a deep breath in. By 2018, my life looked full, successful, purpose-driven. I was the head coach of a top synchronized swimming club in the province, leading a high-performance program with athletes competing at the national and international level. I was the technical director for the province of BC, overseeing Team BC programming, summers spent coaching for Team Canada. I led different initiatives for coaches in the province. I was also working in private practice as a clinical counselor, and I had 2 babies under the age of 3, and I didn't take a maternity leave because the women I aspired to be like didn't either. And because the sport culture I had devoted 2 decades of my life to was so toxic, I convinced myself I could fix it, that I could change it, that if I just worked harder, gave more, pushed through, it would all get better. And every day I woke up with anxiety in my chest, dread to go to work, and yet without fail, I swallowed it, forced myself to keep going, day in and day out. And then at the end of 2018, I decided to leave sport. I hired a succession plan, something I'd been terrified to do for years because the responsibility I held for my athletes was immense. And I remember feeling relief. I thought, wow, my life is really going to get better. But the universe had other plans for me. In 2019, I got pregnant with twins. Yep, twins. And the universe said, stop. Extreme all-day sickness, migraines, no meds, no relief, and no amount of avoiding or pushing through helped me here. Then 2020, I gave birth, and 1 month later, the world shut down. Now I had 4 kids under 5. I could feel the dark cloud of postpartum setting in, and instead of slowing down, instead of finally resting, I enrolled in EMDR training because even though I'd left sport, my pattern didn't change. My survival brain only knew one thing: Go harder, keep proving yourself, never stop. So then came my EMDR training. We were partnered up, and I brought a simple question to the session. Why am I so defensive with one person? And I started tapping. Everything changed. Suddenly, I wasn't sitting in that training session anymore. I was 11 years old again. I was back in a moment of sport trauma, a moment that planted the seed of not good enough, a moment that, without me realizing, had shaped my entire life. And in an instant, 2 decades of pushing, proving, achieving, all flashed before me. The survival pattern that had carried me for so long was suddenly clear. And that realization, it took me out. I had to hire an EMDR practitioner to go back into my childhood and help me process all of these really hard moments, because the real question wasn't, why am I so defensive? The real question was, who am I if I'm not proving myself in the world? Take a deep breath in. So I spent the next 2 years on my own personal journey, unraveling every internalized belief I held, releasing everything I had so furiously held on to. I was forced to put it all down, and it was terrifying. It meant letting go of relationships, friendships, jobs, identities. Everything fell away. And in the darkest moment of my journey, I was given a vision so big that at first I didn't understand it. But what was clear was this: if people truly understood what they were holding, if they had the tools, would they choose to keep holding it? And looking into the eyes of my children, I knew I had to bring this into the world in a bigger way. Now, most people hold a belief that if I go back in and take the lid off of Pandora's box, that it's going to take me out. But the truth is, I wasn't taken out. I wasn't left in bed, unable to move forward. It's the opposite. My life completely changed for the better. And that's why I'm here today, to share my story with you, to plant a seed, to show you another way. Because before we can help anyone, we need capacity within ourselves. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Take a deep breath in. So the cost of carrying too much. Here's the truth. When we stay in caregiving roles for long periods, our brains adapt. They learn to dissociate. How many of you have heard that term before? Dissociation. Drop a 1 in the chat if you have. Some might call it compartmentalizing, some zoning out, some autopilot. But at its core, it's the same thing. It's a survival strategy. It's a way for our brain to protect itself when stress and trauma become too much. Now, here's what happens when we dissociate for too long. We lose connection to ourselves. And when we can't connect to our own emotions, we can't fully connect to others either. It starts small. Feeling distant, zoning out, constantly exhausted, but over time, it chips away at our ability to feel, to be present, and to show up fully. And for many of us, we enter our workspaces giving and giving and giving, and then we return home to the people we love empty, dysregulated from the day, carrying everything that happened, and often without realizing it, we take it out on our partners, our children, the people closest to us. And then when we finally hit the pillow at night, the guilt sets in. The self-violence begins. We struggle to fall asleep, or we wake up in the middle of the night replaying the day, rethinking our actions. Perhaps we wake up in the morning feeling dread in our bodies. And eventually we start moving through life like this. We think, I just need to make it to Friday. I just need to get through this month. I just need to survive until my vacation. But here's the problem. We are not designed to live like this. Take a deep breath in. So let's take a moment right now to come back to this space. Again, I invite you to take another deep breath in and out. Look around you and notice 5 things you see. I want you to notice 4 things you can feel. 3 things you can hear. 2 things you can smell. And 1 thing you can taste. If your mind wandered, it's okay. Just notice it and come back. Because this moment right here is where we start shifting change. So what happens next? What do we do with all this unprocessed stress and trauma? That's what we're going to talk about next, how trauma gets stuck in the brain and how we help the brain release it. All right. How many of you have ever tried EMDR before? Drop a 1 in the chat if you have. Or maybe you've heard about it. You can give me a 2. And give me a 3 if you're not quite sure how it works. Beautiful. Okay, awesome. So we've all heard the phrase, time heals all wounds. But let me be clear, this is not true. Time alone doesn't heal trauma. What it does is bury it deeper into the brain and the body. And when trauma is unprocessed, it doesn't just disappear. Instead, it creates patterns of stress, disconnection, reactivity, and suffering. Now, to understand how trauma works, we need to understand how the brain processes memories. So, our brain has 2 hemispheres, left, right. Our right hemisphere is where emotions and sensations are stored. It holds the feeling attached to a memory, okay? Left hemisphere is where we make sense of things. It's where logic, language, and rational thinking live here. When we experience something overwhelming, whether it's a major trauma or years of accumulated stress, the brain goes into protection mode. Instead of fully processing the event, it gets stuck in the right hemisphere. And I like to say a seed is planted. This means that every time something reminds us of that trauma, that seed gets touched and our brain reacts as if it's happening all over again, even if it's years later. This is why we see patterns like replaying conversations or events in our minds. We call this ruminated thoughts, feeling emotional reactions that seem too big for the situation, avoiding certain people, places, situations without really knowing why. Now, here's the part that surprises most people, as it did me. We can't talk our way out of trauma. Traditional talk therapy works with the left hemisphere, the logical side of the brain, but trauma isn't stored here. It's trapped in the right hemisphere where there are no words, only emotions, sensations, and body memories. So, when we try to talk about a traumatic experience, what actually happens? It lights up the trauma network in the brain, making the body react as if the event is happening again. The brain goes, danger, 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 and the nervous system can be flooded and the person re-traumatized. This is why, for many people, talk therapy alone doesn't create relief. So, if talking isn't enough, how do we help the brain actually process and release the trauma? Everyone take a deep breath in. Blow. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. When we sleep at night, our eyes move back and forth. Did you know that? Drop me a 1 in the chat if you did. This is the brain's way of naturally processing daily events. But when trauma is too overwhelming, the brain can't process it. So this is why we experience symptoms like flashbacks, nightmares, stress dreams, and physical tension. Teeth grinding, anyone? EMDR uses bilateral stimulation, which can be eye movements where your eyes are moving from left to right, or kinesthetically tapping, or we can listen to beeping in our ears to mimic what the brain is supposed to be doing during sleep. So what it does is it helps move stuck trauma memories from the right hemisphere over to the left hemisphere. Now, I like to tell people we think of it like plugging in the lights. Suddenly, we can see the full picture instead of being stuck in the emotions. I love to think of the image of the eagle soaring in the sky. So I remember the exact moment I learned this, and I thought, there is no way that this can be possible, because I had spent 2 decades motivating athletes, pushing through, outworking challenges, and suddenly it all made sense. The patterns, the stress loops, the why behind so many things I had struggled with, and the humans I worked with. Those trauma memories needed help. And when I realized that, everything changed. I started asking bigger questions. So if this research is out there, why aren't we using it? Why aren't more people getting access to this level of healing? Why are we debriefing with talking after critical incidents in healthcare, frontline, and first responder spaces if we know that we are re-traumatizing? That's what we're going to talk about next. So here's what the research tells us. After a traumatic event, we have a critical window, a window of just 90 days before trauma becomes deeply ingrained. That means we don't have years to act. We don't have months. We have 90 days. And during that time, early intervention can reduce long-term trauma symptoms by 50%. 50%. Think about that for a moment. How many of us or people we know have suffered for years because we didn't get the right help at the right time? What if they had access to this type of intervention at that moment? Imagine how different their lives might be. So what does early intervention actually look like? One of the most powerful tools we have is a group protocol called the EMDR Assist. And it's developed by Dr. Ignacio Nacho Ahiro. And Dr. Ahiro has used this protocol in war zones, after natural disasters, and following mass shootings with people who gather in gymnasiums to reprocess immediately. And the research tells us this: when we gather immediately after a traumatic event, within just 1 hour, up to 80% of them will experience significant relief. That means if 100 people are affected, only 10 to 20% will need deeper intervention. The rest, they recover with just 1 session. Now, can you imagine if this kind of support was available to you after your hardest moment? But here's the problem. Most systems today operate on a wait and see model. We wait until people start showing symptoms. We wait until stress turns into burnout, until overwhelm turns into anxiety, until emotional pain turns into chronic suffering. And by the time most people seek help, their symptoms are deeply ingrained, which means treatment takes longer, costs more. So why do we do this with mental health when we would never do this for physical health? Imagine you broke your foot and nobody says to you, just walk it off, come back if you're still in pain in 6 months. And yet when it comes to mental health, that's exactly what happens. We tell people to just cope until one day they're drowning in it and the wait lists are years long. So I want to share something with you, because when we talk about healing, it's one thing to understand the science, but it's another to experience it. So here's what someone who went through a shift change session had to say. I loved the experience today. It's amazing how quickly EMDR can elicit changes in the body. To be able to do this in a group setting, allowing multiple people the opportunity for change, is remarkable. Now let's break that down for a moment. First, this is what makes EMDR so powerful. It doesn't take weeks or months to feel a shift. The brain is designed to heal, and when we give it the right tool, this change can happen quickly. Second, to be able to do this in a group setting is key, because healing doesn't have to be one-on-one. It doesn't have to be isolating. And when done the right way, group EMDR can amplify healing, allowing more people to experience relief together. And this is exactly why we have a stepped approach to making healing accessible at every level. So I want you to think about trauma like carrying weight. Some of us are carrying pebbles, small stressors, everyday frustrations, things that we don't think are a big deal until they are. And these would be considered our small t traumas. Now, some are carrying river rocks, heavier burdens, the accumulation of tough moments or events, unresolved struggles, experiences that sit in our nervous system and make it harder to breathe. And some of us are carrying boulders, the big traumas, and the boulders we've been carrying for years, maybe decades, because we didn't have another option. Now, the research tells us that small t traumas like these pebbles experienced over a long period of time actually have a greater impact than big T do. Take a deep breath in. And the quote about trauma that stopped me dead in my tracks was one by Peter Levine, which says, "Trauma isn't what happened to us, it's what happens inside in the absence of an empathetic witness." If we pause for a second and think about this, if we grew up in suppression culture, there wasn't empathetic witnessing. So let's look at how this stepped approach works. Step 1, early intervention with the EMDR assist. The assist is a 1-hour intervention that helps you put down the pebbles, the fresh stressors that, if left unprocessed, could turn into heavier burdens over time. Now, this approach is nonverbal, and it allows the brain to process what it's holding internally. The research says if we have 90 days to do this before that stress or trauma is integrated into chronic stress or PTSD. From here, we move to a step 2 with the EMDR IGTP. The Integrative Group Treatment Protocol is an EMDR-based group intervention, and it's used worldwide in disaster responses, frontline care, and high-stress work environments to rapidly reduce distress and prevent long-term trauma. IGTP helps you lift the river walks, the stressors that have built up, the memories that keep resurfacing, the emotional weight that's getting harder to hold. If we can attend to people with the assist as a first step intervention, the research says that only 10 to 20% need step 2. But when it comes to frontline work, we know that exposure to vicarious trauma happens daily, which means that if we can offer this stage intervention after a critical incident, we are ensuring that the event or experience is not integrated long-term. Now, what's also beautiful about this protocol is that it uses art therapy to aid in the processing. So again, it's nonverbal, which allows for safety in the processing journey. And then we have step 3, for those who are carrying more than just the small stones. So if we think about it, 100 people are supported with the assist. From there, 10 to 20 people need step 2 intervention. And from there, 10 to 20% need step 3. So 2 to 3 people need more one-to-one intervention. If we take a second to think about that, how would this reduce wait lists? If we could treat a mass amount of people with these first 2 interventions, only the people with complex trauma would need the assistance at the top. This would allow for trauma experts to attend to those that need it most. Can you imagine what impact this would have on our entire system of helping? Breathe. Before we move forward, I want to just take a moment to hear from you. because sometimes we're carrying stress and it can feel like we're the only ones struggling. So let's check in. Take a second and drop a number for me in the chat. Drop a 1 if you feel like you've been carrying pebbles, the small stressors that are piling up. Drop a 2 if you're holding river rocks, things that feel heavier and harder to ignore. And drop a 3 if you're carrying the boulders, deep burdens that you could use relief from. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Look at how many of us are feeling the weight in some way. And I see, yeah, you're not alone. The beautiful thing is, whether you dropped a 1, a 2, or a 3, there is a path forward. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. So healing's personal. It's unique to each of us. But there's one thing I hear over and over again. When people finally experience EMDR, they feel the shift. So I want to share 2 stories with you. So the first person shared this after going through a shift change assist session. After experiencing the most horrific trauma of my life, I noticed a shift in my body, a settling. Kara held a great space and was insightful to my journey, even in a group setting. Take that in for a moment. After the most horrific trauma of their life, they felt a settling in their body. Not after years of therapy, not after reliving the pain over and over, one session. That's what happens when we allow the brain to do what it was designed to do. Now let's look at this next story from someone who wasn't just a participant, but a therapist who works with trauma every day. As a therapist, I frequently encounter vicarious trauma. Experiencing EMDR firsthand was eye-opening. The rapid shifts in my body were remarkable. I hope every frontline worker can access this support. Vicarious trauma is real. The body absorbs what it witnesses, and without a place to process it, that weight builds and builds and builds. But as this therapist experienced, when we give the brain the right conditions, that weight doesn't have to stay. So when I first got trained in these protocols, they were originally designed for Zoom sessions. And I was so excited to share this offering with my existing clients. But then most of my high performers said, I'm not coming. They told me, I'm not going to attend a group where people can see me. And I thought, well, then what? And after talking with a few clients, I knew I had to figure out how to run them anonymously. Because if I'm being honest, if you'd asked me 5 years ago to show up to a group and process the trauma I was holding, I would have said, heck no. Why? Because the systems and spaces that I had been in were never safe. So these sessions weren't just created out of theory. They were also built from the voices of people like you, people who can feel shame or weakness for carrying the burden, fear retribution for expressing emotions, or thought they were doing something wrong for feeling the way that they did. Now, we know that for healing to happen, these barriers had to be removed. For me, group spaces, like I said, have always been unsafe, and so it was important to create something where I listened to the feedback. So first, it's anonymous. First and foremost, your privacy is protected. So while your camera stays on for the facilitator, it remains off for everyone else. You can see me and I can see you, but no one in the session can see you. This ensures you can participate without fear of exposure or judgment. But I know many of you work in environments where mental health conversations still feel risky, where being seen in a space like this might raise questions or concern. Here, that's not a worry. Second, it's nonverbal. You don't have to explain your trauma. You don't have to share the story. You don't even have to put to words what you're feeling, because the brain already knows what to do. This EMDR protocol allows your brain and body to naturally process what's been stuck without needing words. And for so many people, this is a huge relief, because let's be honest, sometimes we don't even have the words for what we're holding. And the third part of this that is incredible is that it's based on shared energy. So even though others can't see you, you feel their presence in the space. This creates a powerful sense of connection, reminding you that you're not the only one carrying this weight. That in itself can be healing. So what can you expect in the session? I want you to imagine for a second, just close your eyes. Imagine you're sitting in a quiet space in the comfort of your home, knowing that you are fully supported. You follow my guidance using gentle bilateral stimulation called the butterfly hug to help your brain process what's stuck, and you don't have to force it. You don't have to revisit the details. Your brain does the work for you. Take a deep breath in and blow. So let's talk about practical tools for regulation because everybody wants to have these. And let's be real, life is going to keep happening. Stressful situations won't just disappear. Challenges won't stop coming. But what can we do to equip ourselves with the tools to handle them in a way that doesn't drain us completely? So I want to share my dinghy metaphor because understanding short-term versus long-term relief, I believe, is really important. So I want to invite you to close your eyes one more time. And I want you to imagine you're back out in the ocean again. You're in deep water. The waves are crashing around you, and it's exhausting to keep swimming. And then you find a dinghy. You climb in, and for a while it helps. You're like, no longer treading water. You catch your breath. Sun's on your face. This feels good. But here's the problem. A dinghy isn't meant for long-term travel. Eventually, the air runs out, the boat deflates, and you're back in the water. And this is what many regulation tools are like. They keep us afloat, they help us get through the moment, but they don't take the weight off. And that's okay. We need these tools, but we also need to recognize when it's time to go deeper, when it's time to stop patching the boat and actually get to shore. That being said, these tools can be incredibly helpful in the moment, and I share them with my clients all the time. Are you interested in learning about some of them? Drop me a yes in the chat if you are. All right, so here are a few that you can use anytime. So the first one we might be familiar with is just called square breathing. It's a 4-part breath. But I like to preface this because one time I shared with a client that we were going to do it in increments of 4, and it was hard for her to hold her breath for 4 counts. And so she came back and said, I can't do that 4-breath breathing. And I said, oh, well, I'm sorry. I should have told you that it didn't have to be 4. So what we're going to do is we're going to just practice it together. I like to just place my hand on my chest. This is where I normally feel stress. So I'd invite you just to place your hand on a part of your body where you tend to hold stress or tension, okay? So what we're gonna do, breath work is one of the fastest ways to regulate our nervous system. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna inhale for 4. So deep breath in, 2, 3, 4, and hold, 2, 3, 4, and exhale, 2, 3, 4, and rest, 2, 3, 4. So we want to repeat this cycle a few times, and you'll start to feel your system settle. Now, it's important to preface this, like I said before, if 4 feels too much, choose 3, choose 2, but just honor your body and do what feels best. Okay, the second one is called head holding. Okay, so this is for nervous system regulation, another technique. Okay, so why this one is so important is because when we get dysregulated, the blood from the prefrontal cortex moves back to the reptilian brain. I like to tell clients that when we have a lizard sitting on our shoulder, no rational thinking happens here. So we want the blood to return. This is especially helpful when you feel overwhelmed, disconnected, or out of control. So all you do is place one hand on your forehead and the other on the back of your head. Okay, we're going to hold it here. And we take slow, deep breaths and notice how we help bring the blood back to the center of our head. Okay. All right. And then earlier we did the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise, which is a great way to bring yourself back to the present moment. these are all ways to ground ourselves. And one of my favorites is also to lie on the floor, put my legs up on the wall. And so for me, physically getting on the floor feels best. All right. So here's a few takeaways that you can have to help you with regulation in those hard moments. So now that we've talked about why this work matters, let's talk about how you can actually access it. Because for too long, mental health care has been complicated, overwhelming, full of barriers that make it harder to get support, and the wait lists are growing. At Shift Change, we've designed a system that removes these barriers. So there's 5 ways. 1, your first session is completely free. We know that sometimes the hardest part is just taking the first step, so we've made it easy to just show up and let us guide you. Number 2, it's anonymous. Like I mentioned before, your camera stays on for me, but it's off for everyone else. This creates a safe space where you can fully participate without fear of being seen or judged. So weekly sessions are scheduled for ongoing support because healing isn't a one-time event. It's a process. And that's why we offer them weekly, just like you would attend a yoga session. Some people come every week, some come once a month, some come when they need a reset. The key is you can access support when you need it. EMDR is also covered by most insurance plans. And so we know that can be a barrier to getting help. And number 5, for workplaces and organizations, and for those in leadership roles, we also offer packages designed for workplaces, schools, teams, because let's be honest, many of us are working in environments where stress, burnout, and vicarious trauma are the norm. But it doesn't have to be this way. And so organizations that provide mental health support see higher retention, less absenteeism, and better overall well-being. Because at the end of the day, it shouldn't be complicated. It should be something that's available when you need it the most. So I'm going to guide us in one last exercise as we come to the end here. So what I want you to do is close your eyes, and I want you to think about something you've been carrying. Maybe it's a stress from work. Maybe it's exhaustion from taking care of everyone. Maybe it's a burden you haven't spoken out loud, but you feel it every single day. Take a moment and let yourself just acknowledge it. And now let's breathe. Take a deep breath in and exhale slowly. Do that again. Inhale and exhale. Bring your attention to your body and notice any areas that feel heavy, tense, or unsettled. Maybe it's in your chest, your shoulders, your stomach, wherever it is, just observe it without trying to change it. Now I want you to imagine that this sensation has a shape. What does it look like? Does it have a size, a color, a texture, a temperature? There's no right or wrong answer, just notice what comes. Now imagine a warm, soothing light entering the top of your head. This light is your favorite color. It's the perfect temperature, and it begins to gently move through your body, filling every part of you with calm and ease. Now let's pretend that the source of the soothing, healing light is like the infinite cosmos, so the more of it you use, the more you have available. Allow this light to come in more and more, resonating and vibrating in and around the shape. With every breath, notice that the shape is getting smaller, lighter, softer, until it melts away. Now let this light expand, filling every part of your body, from the tips of your toes to the top of your head. You are surrounded by this calm, healing energy. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, just here in this moment, completely at ease. Now slowly bringing your awareness back to the space, wiggle your fingers and your toes. I'm going to count upwards from 1 to 5, and I want you to bring your whole and complete self back into the room now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when you're ready, gently open your eyes. Take a moment to notice. Does anything feel different? Drop a 1 if you feel a little bit lighter. As we close, I want to leave you with this thought. There are tribes around the world who do something different after a traumatic event, something we rarely see in Western culture. Instead of isolating, instead of pretending it didn't happen, they gather. They circle around a fire, they hold space, they witness each other. Because they understand something powerful, that healing doesn't happen in silence. It doesn't happen in shame. It happens when we are witnessed. You are not exempt from care. And so I want to say this clearly to you. You are not exempt from it. The same compassion, the same support, the same healing you so freely offer others, it is meant for you too. You are not an exception, and you do not have to hold this alone. And if you have never truly experienced that kind of care, if you have spent your life caring more than your share, I want you to know I see you. At Shift Change, our mission is to transform the way we attend to mental injuries, to create a space where witnessing and healing come together, where care is not an afterthought, because this is bigger than just us. This is about building a legacy of healing, one that will impact generations to come. So as we close today, I invite you to take one more deep breath in and out, and just pause and ask yourself, what would it feel like to truly put the weight down? That possibility exists, and when you're ready, it's here, one tap at a time. I know this is a lot to take in, and you may have questions about today's session, about EMDR, about how this can support you or your team. So before we wrap up, I want to open the space for you. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'm here and love to answer anything that's on your mind. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yeah, so someone had a question. So I have provided some links with Carissa. There are, I can't remember how many articles that are written with this protocol for a whole client population. And one of the questions was asking about dementia. You know, I know that there is an article that we can link to you. So if you want to send me an email, I can send that over. How frequently do you find your clients benefit from participating? So right now, what I found is that lots of people choose to do them sort of in between sessions or on a weekly basis. You know, the name Shift Change came when I was sitting and trying to decide what the name of this business was going to be. And I thought, can you imagine if after every shift, people had access to this? And so my dream actually is that after every shift where we work in these spaces, that we could reprocess this. That's my dream for it. But right now, I would say typically I'm running weekly sessions in the platform. You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, this is a really great question. Can sessions be done by yourself when you've had a few sessions and know the basis of it? Okay, so this is what is important about EMDR. Now, in therapy world, it's not regulated space to space. And why I shared my personal story at the beginning was because there are lots of spaces and programs that operate virtually online that allow you to do EMDR by yourself. But I want you to remember what I told you. Our brain will store trauma. So like in my example, when I started tapping and I'm asking a question around why am I so defensive? I was taken back to a trauma that I had no consciousness about. Now, lots of times trauma happens in relationship with attachments, right? And so we know that trauma happens a lot in those spaces. And so part of healing is to also be witnessed and to be seen when you're processing a trauma. And so it's very important to be led, because when I had experienced that in my class, I was not ready for it. I was not expecting it. And like I said, it took me out, and it took me about 3 weeks to recover from what I saw. And so it's really important that we are led in case something like that happens, then when you have somebody who's trained to help support you through that. Pacific Blue Cross. So that's something that you could send me an email about. EMDR and registered clinical counselors are covered. And so the people who are showing up into sessions, you get a receipt as if you've come to an RCC covered session. And so in the province of British Columbia, most RCCs are now covered by insurance companies. But you can send me that and I can send you more information about it. Oh yeah. Can EMDR benefit those that suffer absolutely. Clinical depression and anorexia. So those are, the labels that we give to those conditions. The truth is though, that a lot of times based on different experiences that we've had early in childhood, there are parts of us that are burdened with trauma. And so my experience of doing EMDR work is that people who have clinical depression and struggle with things like anorexia, those are younger parts of us that are stuck and frozen in trauma time. And when we can go to them with EMDR and offer some parts work with the EMDR, it's actually really amazing what we can do in those spaces. And I have some articles to send you for that. If you want to email me, I can send them out. You're welcome. You're welcome. Oh yeah. Prescribing of sleep meds. So I have a bias around all of this. And, I think Gabor Mate talks a lot about medications and, moments where it can be helpful. And I'm not a doctor, so I'm not, but what I do know to be true is that because we've grown up in suppression culture, when we are prescribed medication after an event, the only thing we're doing is suppressing. We can still do EMDR. This is one of the most incredible things, that even if you're taking prescription, EMDR is still beneficial. We are literally rewiring the brain. And so whether you're taking medication or not, the EMDR will still have an impact. I do think though that lots of times when people have grown up in spaces where they've been given medication for certain things, that becomes an internalized belief that like there's something wrong with me and I'm going to be like this forever. So, there's some things to consider when we come there. As a counselor, what's a good starting place to learn more about EMDR as a provider? Yeah. So, first of all, you have to get your EMDR certification. So the EMDR Center of Canada is where I did my training with Jasmine Alexander. I think she's a fantastic educator and facilitator. And she was, an important person in my life when I started that. And then once you get trained in EMDR, then to get certified, you require some supervision. And then after that, you can start to learn and get trained in all the other things like the assist and the different models that I mentioned in this presentation. Absolutely helps with ADHD. People can join from anywhere. So I have people that join from Europe. The beautiful thing is that we can provide worldwide. So the risk to EMDR is that we always front load people with the information where when you show up to a session, we always ask you that when the brain holds trauma, there is a possibility that your brain has suppressed something that you have no memory about. And so when you enter into spaces, you're entering into the space in agreement that you're okay, that if something comes forward that you weren't ready for, that you're going to be okay with seeing what that is. Now, in the assist protocol, that's the 1 hour intervention, we are not opening up trauma memory. Okay, so that's an important distinction. EMDR assist is to help stabilize the nervous system immediately. That's different than doing a one-to-one EMDR session where we're going into a stored trauma and we're fully reprocessing it from the beginning. Is it true that EMDR therapists don't know your trauma because it's silent therapy? So typically what happens is, and so I'll just use my example because it's easy. You come into a space and I said, okay, this memory has surfaced. There's this 11-year-old memory that I have when I was in sport. And so it's called a target. You choose a target. And so for me, that target was a moment on a pool deck. And so from there, all I do is start by looking at that moment on the pool deck. And then my brain offers me all of the other moments that are connected to that one. So just because we've experienced this thing and we think of the whole event as being very scary, the brain's only going to hold certain pieces of the memory. Okay. And so depending on what the trauma is, as you're reprocessing with tapping and your eyes are moving from right to left, what you're doing is you're desensitizing the experience. So that means that it allows us to be able to see that moment and not be flooded. Can you see, as I was sharing my story about my life, I wasn't sitting here and crying and dysregulated by sharing the story. That's because my nervous system has completely been desensitized to those memories and those experiences, that I can safely now sit here and tell you about them without the risk of being taken out by those memories.